Undercover cops, what's the most insane thing you had to do to not blow your cover? Story 1. My cousin was an undercover ATF agent. Anyway, they were trying to bust some people for illegal alcohol distribution and were building rapport by going undercover. My cousin didn't take his ATF badge with him during operations because if anyone ever saw it, he could get shot. One day, some aggressive, uniformed officers came over and started harassing them. My cousin couldn't blow his cover, but pretty soon the officers started getting physical and beat up both my cousin and the individuals he was trying to gather evidence on. They took them all to the police station, only to find out later that my cousin was ATF. He was furious because law enforcement officers aren't supposed to use unnecessary force. He is currently filing a lawsuit against that police department. Story 2. When I first got started in forensics, it was around the time chat rooms and webcams were becoming popular. So predators thought they'd be able to figure out who they were talking to online. They assumed it was obvious they were chatting with a 40-year-old man eating donuts, not a 14-year-old girl. I was a naive 18-year-old woman, just starting out in law enforcement, doing clerical work for my hometown police department. I overheard a few officers talking about how it had become harder to catch predators now that webcams were common. I suggested hiring someone to act as an underage child and coach them on how to talk and arrange meetings in order to catch these individuals. Eventually, I volunteered for the role myself. We set up a bedroom in one of the upstairs offices, complete with a bed, a desk, and some posters borrowed from one of the officers' teenage daughters. I wore some of my high school sports gear or pajamas while talking to predators via webcam. I passed notes back and forth with the team and pretended I was doing homework while chatting. The hardest part was acting interested and innocent, while these people were describing inappropriate things they wanted to do, thinking I was still a child. Story 3. As a former correctional officer, we once had a case where a major police department placed an undercover officer in our prison to gather intel on an inmate they believed was organizing criminal activity from behind bars. The warden knew, and I found out accidentally, but no other correctional officers or staff, including medical, were informed. That was exactly how they wanted it. The officer went through intake like everyone else. He was processed, classified, and assigned housing. It was surreal. He stayed there for a week, got the information needed, and was quietly removed. It didn't become public knowledge that he had been undercover until long after I had already left the job. That moment still feels unreal. Story 4. One time a Homeland Security officer came to my house, undercover, flashed his badge, and asked if he could come in. Once inside, he pulled out a piece of paper with my neighbor's face on it. He asked if I had seen him around lately. When I said I hadn't and asked what he did, the officer told me what he was wanted for: rape, child abuse, drugs, the whole list. It turned out he had assaulted his stepdaughter, and once he found out he was wanted, he fled back to El Salvador. I always thought they only flash badges in the movies, but it turns out the reality is just as serious. Story 5. Not a cop myself, but a man my mom dated for a long time was. He's in his 70s now, but back then he was fresh out of the academy and stationed at the Asbury Park riots. It was terrifying and heartbreaking. Later, he became an undercover narcotics officer for 14 years during the 70s and 80s with the New Jersey State Police. He was Puerto Rican, fluent in Spanish, a former Marine, and became a state trooper. They used his background to help him blend into organized crime circles in the Latin community. One time during a drug buy, he had to do coca in front of a group to prove himself. He stuck his knife into a mound and took a huge amount. Right after, he started having a minor panic attack, thinking they would realize he was a cop. His heart was racing, and he went outside for air. One of the men followed him, and he braced himself to either run or fight. But the guy just said, "Man, I've never seen someone snort that much at once. You okay?" He let out a huge sigh of relief and said, "Yeah, I've never done that much. I'm having trouble breathing, haha." The guy was actually kind, brought him a drink, and they had a cigarette together. Everyone joked that he had the heart of a lion. He ended up feeling bad when that man was arrested later. He said he even tried to help him get a reduced sentence. There are more stories, but that one stuck with me. Story 6. My dad worked undercover for several years and once told me about a woman who was heavily involved with meth. He spent a lot of time with her, even babysitting her kids while she went out to get high. This went on for months while the team gathered information on the main dealers and secured warrants. He had a beard, a fake ID, and drove a rundown car to stay under the radar. Eventually, they had enough to move in. At the time, he was also on the SWAT team, so he was one of the officers who raided the homes and made arrests. He wore a balaclava to protect his identity during the operation. He said it was incredibly hard emotionally because he had become a trusted presence in those kids' lives and felt a connection to them. After the arrest, their mother was gone, and the children had to be taken to Child Protective Services. I wish I had asked him more about it before he passed. I still don't know how he managed to live that double life and then come home acting like a normal husband and father. Story 7. Not a cop, but I fell prey to an undercover operation. I feel obligated to start by saying how impressed I am with how deeply integrated this man was in our gang. If Oscar-worthy performances are the standard, I have to say, I'm genuinely impressed by what law enforcement can pull off. Over the course of several months, this officer earned our trust. Honestly, at one point, I would have said I trusted him more than my own brother, who was also in the gang. To be fair, I caught my brother stealing product from us more than once, but I still trusted him not to directly ruin our operation. This officer's performance was one of the biggest reasons we were ultimately taken down. This man, let's call him Dave, was fearless and tough as nails. One of our initiation rituals involved letting members beat on you for 3 full minutes, no holding back. If you were still breathing afterward, you were in. Dave got pummeled by 7 or 8 different guys and not only survived, it seemed like he almost enjoyed it. Probably because he knew he just earned his way in. To explain the craziest thing Dave did, I need to share how our gang operated. Members started off being referred to by numbers. It helped keep identities secret and reminded lower-level members of their place. You had to earn your name. There wasn't a fixed rule for how, but you had to generate money, prove loyalty, and commit acts of violence that benefited the gang. All names followed an astronomy theme. Our leader was known as Vega. The day Dave earned his name, Vega had him act as the getaway driver for a crew that was tasked with hitting a rival dealer's house, stealing his product, and fleeing in Dave's car. During the escape, someone opened fire on them, and Dave took a bullet to the forearm. Without slowing down, he managed to get the guy safely back to our house, using only one arm to steer. Vega and I rushed him to the ER as he sat calmly, pressing a jacket against the wound, trying to breathe through the pain. By the next day, he was already back. Everyone praised him and thanked him. Vega walked over with a name tag and pinned it to Dave's shirt, officially promoting him from a number to a name. He was now serious. I don't hold any grudges against him for the bust. That man saved my life. Wherever you are, man, thank you. You changed me for the better. I'll never forget the day you earned your serious tag. Story 8. Not a cop, but I did work for the liquor board in the city next to mine, busting bars for serving underage customers. Whenever I was served alcohol, I'd text the officer in charge. He'd come in, take a picture of me with the drink, and then find the bar, usually a few $100s. The bar would also get a strike, 3 strikes, and they'd lose their liquor license. When I got served, I wasn't allowed to actually drink the alcohol. Only once did I have to drink it. I was at a sketchy biker bar known for underage drinking. They already had 2 strikes. They also had a reputation for getting rough with informants. Some employees and patrons had assaulted others my age, 18 to 20. I walked in and asked for a Budweiser. I showed them my real ID and the bartender still served me. Before I could even pull out my phone, the bartender grabbed my wrist and asked if I worked for the liquor board. I said no, and he replied, "Okay, then chug your beer." So I slammed the bottle down, and he let go. Then he looked at me and said, "I've got my eye on you, boy," and handed me another Budweiser. I snapped a picture of myself at the bar with the beer and got out of there as fast as I could. I showed the photo to the officer and explained what happened. He went into the bar and ended up finding both the bar and the bartender, giving them their final strike. They took the case to court, and I was called in to testify. I told the judge everything that happened. The bar lost. As I was walking out to my car, the owner shouted, "Hey kid, watch your back. You'll get what's coming to you." So far, nothing has happened. That was about 3 years ago. Hopefully, nothing ever will. Story 9. Not a cop, but in college I took a few criminal justice classes. Our professor, who I'll call Bob, had been a police officer for about 15 years and had gone undercover for a long time in the 1980s. Bob was a biker as a hobby, and he was sent undercover to break up a meth ring within the biker community. He arranged to buy some meth from a dealer and shortly after the transaction, that dealer was arrested. The dealer's sister started telling people she thought Bob was a cop, and soon some of the other bikers began questioning him. A day or so after the sister started accusing Bob of being an informant, the entire group was at a bar. Bob told a few of the guys to meet him outside in a few minutes, and he told the sister he had some meth for her and asked her to come outside as well. Once they were all outside, Bob looked at her and said, "Where I'm from, friends don't call friends informants." Then in front of the group, he physically assaulted her. He kicked her hard between the legs, painful even for a woman, and punched her 4 or 5 times in the face hard. He said he didn't want to do it, but after that incident, no one ever questioned whether he was a cop again. Story 10. Not an officer, but I ended up on the wrong side of an undercover operation. In college, I developed an addiction to opioids, and it quickly got out of control. I couldn't afford my habit, so I started selling just to support my usage. It was a terrible thing to do, but addiction makes you do reckless things and clouds your judgment. A guy I sold to regularly, let's call him Larry, came over one night with his best friend from high school. The friend looked around our age, early 20s, and I considered Larry a close friend. We had known each other for 4 years and hung out often. Larry asked if his friend could have my number, saying he was moving to the area for work and needed a connection. I agreed, and that was that. I never sold on campus, but this new guy only wanted to meet in the school parking lot. I kept refusing, but eventually I hit a dry spell and got desperate. I finally agreed. I gave him 2 pills for $60 and turned to leave his truck. That's when I felt a hand on my arm. Another man was grabbing me, and he had a gun pointed at me. I thought I was getting robbed. Turns out it was law enforcement, and my friend had set me and others up to get a reduced sentence. The system is deeply flawed. Their main goal seems to be arresting college students and threatening them with heavy sentences, using mandatory minimums to pressure them into becoming confidential informants. You're released without supervision, expected to stay in contact with undercover officers, and tasked with supplying names for more arrests. There's no real effort to rehabilitate you. Larry, despite being a CI, continued using. The officers didn't drug test him or offer help. They just wanted more arrests. It's a broken system that preys on vulnerable young addicts. Larry lived alone and had to keep everything secret to protect the operation and his status. He went silent for a few days and no one knew why. His best friend went to check on him and found him dead in his apartment. He had overdosed alone roughly 36 to 48 hours before he was found. I chose not to cooperate with the police. Instead, I went to rehab, then jail, and was released on parole and probation. I faced a mandatory minimum of 4 years. The judge told me I should be grateful because I could have served up to 30. I'm lucky to be alive. I know too many people who weren't. Story 11. I used to be the night manager of an adult store. One night, a visibly intoxicated vice officer and his date came in. The officer started bragging about how he had been part of the team that recently shut down a local strip club. Every Friday, according to him, the police chief would hand him and his partner $1,000 in cash and send them to the club with instructions to do whatever they could to catch illegal activity, namely drugs and prostitution. Apparently, their first few visits didn't yield anything, but eventually the officer in my store managed to persuade one of the dancers to perform a Sewell act on him. He said that after the act, he flashed his badge before she could even react. Then he demanded to use our bathroom. I told him no. Public restrooms and adult retail spaces are not a good mix for many reasons. He insisted, flashing his badge again. I said it didn't matter. He responded by urinating in his pants right there in the store and then blamed me for it before storming out with his date. Story 12. This happened back in 2001 in Los Angeles, before September 11th, when things were very different. At the time, I was new to the force and not very well known, which made me a good candidate to go undercover. I was assigned to investigate a Latino gang suspected of robbing trucks just outside the city. The gang's method involved using cars to box in trucks on the highway, forcing them to stop so the goods could be stolen. There hadn't been any deaths, but injuries had occurred, and the stolen merchandise added up to a serious loss. I ended up earning the gang's trust pretty quickly. Most of them were actually pretty decent people, all things considered. They had their own dramas, of course. There was a girl who hung out with the group and seemed interested in me. I figured I could use that connection to stay close to them, and I was right. One guy, who wasn't her boyfriend but acted like he was, gave me a hard time about it, but the rest of the gang defended me. They saw how unreasonable he was being. I spent the next few weeks just hanging out with them. Honestly, it didn't seem like they were responsible for the robberies. They mostly just drank, talked, and raced cars. Nothing serious. I even participated in a few races myself, which might qualify as the craziest thing I did to maintain my cover. But things escalated when I was introduced to a separate group, a small Vietnamese gang. They were more intense, didn't like me, and definitely didn't like the Latino gang leader I was hanging with. They even trashed my car once. I started digging into them and found that they were moving merchandise that matched what had been reported stolen. I was relieved, thinking I had found the real culprits and that the people I'd grown to like weren't involved after all. I reported what I found, and my team raided the Vietnamese gang's location, but it turned out everything they had was legally purchased. My handler was furious. He said the truckers' union was now arming themselves out of fear, and if I didn't figure things out fast, someone was going to get hurt. Eventually, I discovered that the leader of the Latino gang, the guy I had been spending time with, was actually the mastermind behind the robberies. During a heist gone wrong, I was able to witness everything and gather solid evidence. The fallout was immediate, including violence between both gangs as everyone turned on each other. My superiors were focused on arresting the gang leader. I arranged a meetup to trap him, but instead he challenged me to a street race. It ended with him crashing his car, and I don't know why, but I didn't arrest him. I handed him the keys to my car and let him go. It was a crazy decision, but I still believe it was the right one. Because in the end, what matters most in life is family. Story 13. Not an undercover cop myself, but a friend of mine was. Here's the story. Back in college, I had a classmate who needed a lot of help getting back into school after being away for a while. Because I helped her so much, I quickly became like part of her family and was always invited to their gatherings. Her husband was a cool guy. We talked sports, played pool, that sort of thing. But whenever I or anyone else asked what he did for a living, he'd get vague and dodge the question. So we let it go. I found out he was undercover because I almost blew his cover in public. At the time, I worked at a mall. One day on my way to work, I saw him with a group of guys who looked sketchy. I walked up to him and said, "Hey man, what's up? What you up to, bro?" He looked at me like he'd seen a ghost and quickly started berating me, acting like he didn't know who I was. At the same time, he was giving me these wide-eyed looks like, "Get the hell out of here." But I didn't catch on right away. Then the guys he was with came out of a store and thought I was a problem. They started threatening me. My friend played it off like I was just some random guy causing trouble and that he had handled it. Everything was fine until one of the guys suggested they do something to me. For a second, none of us, me, the undercover cop, or the others, knew if he was serious. Then the guy laughed and said, "Just messing with you, kid. Get out of here." I ran like crazy toward the nearest exit. Weeks later, I saw my friend's husband in a calmer setting and asked what happened. He told me I had bumped into him while he was on duty and that the guys he was with were part of a trafficking gang he was investigating. I had nearly blown his cover by mentioning his family, something he wasn't supposed to have, according to the gang. He told me I was lucky because the guy who threatened me was high, and that's probably the only reason nothing worse happened. A few days later, they raided the group and brought them down. My friend requested a division transfer right after that. Story 14. I used to work third shift at the front desk of a budget hotel while I was in college. A shady couple checked in and stayed for about 2 weeks. Every night, we'd get phone calls for their room at all hours, and we knew something strange was going on. One night, I came in for work and saw my manager and the police waiting in the lobby. They told me that room 204 had been busted for dealing drugs. That night, the officers were going to stay in the room undercover. I was instructed to forward any calls for the room to them like everything was normal. All night long, calls came in, and I forwarded them. About 10 minutes later, each time, I'd see a car drive past the lobby headed for that room. Then I'd watch the police intercept them. That happened 7 or 8 times in one night. It felt kind of cool being part of a sting operation, even if just in a small way. Story 15. Okay, the usual. I'm not a cop, but I worked in forensic psychology for over 15 years. Not long after I started, there was a story in the paper about a young officer who had just graduated from the academy. He looked incredibly young, more like a teenager. So his superiors assigned him to infiltrate schools under the guise of being a high school student to combat what they called the growing drug problem. It went well at first, but eventually he started using coca. This was in the early 1980s when that drug was rampant. His habit got so bad that even his supervisors noticed, and he was arrested. They sent him to us to figure out what went wrong and whether he was responsible for his addiction. He looked so young and scared. I genuinely felt bad for him. Not only was his career over, but he also faced criminal charges and ended up in a psychiatric hospital. By the time he got to us, he had developed a hole in his septum from snorting so much coca. He was eventually convicted, though I can't recall how much time he received. Story 16. I was a bartender in Florida for a summer when I was in my mid-20s, often left alone to run the bar and lobby on weekends. It could be nerve-wracking as a woman working alone, but I enjoyed helping tourists and chatting with customers until one particular night. A man walked in and immediately sat at the far corner of the bar, back to the wall, eyes on the door. Red flags went off. He screamed undercover cop. He was in street clothes. No problem. I asked him what he wanted to drink. He nursed a couple glasses of water and quietly observed everyone. He left after a while. He kept showing up every few days, and during slower times, we'd chat or he'd join conversations with other customers. He claimed he was a local undertaker, and I played along, pretending he was sipping vodka on the rocks. About a month later, I was working another solo weekend shift. My boss left me alone with a wooden bat with a weighted end named Just In Case. I joked about it with my regular, not cop. That night, a local dealer showed up with a girl. He was clearly not in a good place. After a few shots, he started causing trouble. I tried to de-escalate, but my regular stepped in and asked him to leave. The dealer shoved him and mocked his clothes and height. I asked the dealer to leave. My regular backed me up, and the dealer challenged him to a fight outside. The door barely closed before the guy was on the ground in cuffs. The girl slipped out the back. Turns out my not-a-cop regular was in fact undercover and had been investigating that dealer. I thought that was the last I'd see of him, but he showed up on my last weekend in town. When things calmed down, he called me over and handed me a slip of paper with his badge number on it. He said he wouldn't have been able to get so much intel without my help. I told him to come up with a better cover story next time and to stop acting so much like a cop. I had him pegged from day one. We laughed, and later that week, we finally had a beer together when neither of us was working. Story 17. I had a first-hand experience with an undercover cop who was clearly trying to bust me for something. It was surreal in a hilarious way. I lived in an apartment above a store in the middle of a small town's downtown area, which was mostly commercial space. Being a musician into noise and industrial music, my friends and I would sometimes crank the volume to the point where sound would bounce through buildings and be heard 2 blocks away. One night, the cops came to the door and said, "We've received complaints and are asking you to turn the volume down." I latched onto the word asking and immediately responded with, "So asking, legally, I don't have to, right?" They looked disappointed and said, "Technically, that was correct." I thanked them, shut the door, and went right back to blasting music obnoxiously loud. Later that night, around 3 a.m., I had Skinny Puppy playing at full volume with the windows open when I heard someone shouting, "Yeah!" up toward my window. I looked out and saw a strong-looking guy with a 10-speed bike yelling about how he liked the music. It was so random I had to go down and talk to him. As soon as I got close, I noticed he reeked of alcohol, like he had doused his shirt in it. He launched into a weird monologue about working at a nuclear plant and getting drug tested, but still wanting to score some weed. I told him I didn't do drugs and barely drank, but he kept pressing, talking about buying drugs despite knowing he'd be tested at work. I found the whole situation entertaining and let the conversation drag on. Then he randomly asked, "You got a sister?" I said I did, and he replied, "I want to sleep with your sister." I laughed. I wasn't sure if he was trying to provoke me, but I just shrugged it off and wished him luck. He circled back to trying to buy drugs. Coincidentally, I spotted someone I knew walking a block away. I pointed at her and said, "Go talk to her. I know she smokes pot." Naturally, he ignored that. Finally, a police car sped up and stopped behind him. The guy subtly tried to wave the cop off without me noticing, tucking his arm to his side and flapping his fingers. It was very obvious. At that point, I said, "So you're working, huh?" He sheepishly admitted it. After 15 to 30 minutes of going nowhere, he hopped on his 10-speed and pedaled off into the night. I went back upstairs and continued unleashing noise pollution across the quiet downtown. Strangely enough, no cops ever came back again. Story 18. This isn't my story, but it's one of my dad's best friend's experiences. He was a detective in Hong Kong during the 1970s and 80s, back when the city was still under British rule. When Mormon missionaries started showing up in the rougher neighborhoods, the local gangs didn't think twice about doing illegal things right in front of them, in broad daylight. The assumption was that these missionaries weren't a threat. So when Ian, the detective, caught wind of this, he and his team decided to lean into the confusion. They started dressing like missionaries, white shirts, black name tags, and backpacks, but with a twist. They hollowed out actual blue books to carry their guns and badges, made their name tags read Detective X instead of Brother X, and used their backpacks to store other police gear. It was a bold and clever move. Nobody in those neighborhoods spoke much English, so even though the team was clearly labeling themselves as law enforcement, they were still mistaken for missionaries. And because of that, the criminal element didn't hesitate to expose themselves. In just 3 months, they made so many arrests that the top representative of the missionary group actually flew in to file a complaint with the police department. The concern? No one was letting real missionaries into their homes anymore. Everyone thought they were undercover cops. Story 19. My mother was a Los Angeles police officer for most of the late 1970s. Because she didn't care about fitting any stereotypes and was as tough as they come, she was selected to go undercover during the Hillside Strangler investigation. She spent most of December 1977 and January 1978 posing as a prostitute around Los Angeles. Her job was to dress the part and hang out in parks, trying to get picked up. One night, she actually had a conversation with Kenneth Bianchi when he pulled up to check her out. She didn't fit their usual victim profile. She was 28 at the time, so they didn't take her. Years later, I had the nerve to accuse her of making it up, and she responded by showing me photographs she took of the van that Bianchi and Buono were later found to have used. Chilling stuff. She has an entire collection of wild stories, like the time she busted a PCP lab while 8 months pregnant with me, or when she dropped a handcuffed rapist face first to the ground after he tried to punch her. She once chased gang members on foot through alleys in South Central, and even diffused a hostage situation where the suspect claimed to be receiving messages from outer space. She's pretty much my hero. Story 20. I'm not a cop, but I've had 2 memorable encounters with undercover officers. The first happened during spring break in Daytona Beach. The hotel lobby was packed with drunk college students, myself included, all waiting for the elevator. I found myself standing next to a guy in his late 30s wearing khaki cargo shorts, a white t-shirt, and an unbuttoned Hawaiian shirt. Around his neck was a chain with a police badge inside one of those leather holders. He was chatting casually with another man dressed similarly, also wearing a badge. I must have been staring because the guy noticed and suddenly asked, "Hey, do you have any pot?" I told him no, and then it hit me. Why would an undercover officer blatantly ask me something like that in front of everyone? I asked if that actually worked, and he said surprisingly, it often did. The second encounter was more intense. I was working as an exotic dancer at a club that had drawn the attention of a local county official. That official owned property nearby and wasn't happy the club had opened, as he claimed it was hurting the value of his investments. Because of that, the club saw frequent visits from liquor board inspectors, health officials, and others looking for violations. One night, a customer asked me for a lap dance. We went upstairs, and as I was dancing, facing away from him, I slid down between his knees to the floor. As I moved my hands along his shins down to his ankles, I felt something hard beneath the fabric. It was definitely a handgun. I froze. I looked back at him, trying not to panic because it was very likely he was an undercover cop. He looked at me, gave a slight smile, and told me everything was fine, that I hadn't done anything wrong. I got up, he thanked me, walked downstairs, and left. I was too shaken to continue working and spent the rest of the night sitting in the dressing room, convinced the club was about to get raided. Story 21. Not law enforcement myself, but I played hockey for years on a team mostly made up of guys from various law enforcement agencies. Only 2 of us weren't cops. Over the years, I heard a lot of wild stories, but the one that stuck with me came from a bomb squad guy. It wasn't about undercover work, but it's haunted me ever since. He also worked as a detective, And one day he brought photos into the locker room. They were from a repaving project that took place on what used to be the edge of town. Now the area is completely built up, and I drive that road all the time to reach the freeway. It gives me chills every single time. His case involved a roads crew death. A worker was slowly run over by a steamroller, feet first. The man was gradually crushed, and by the time the roller reached his abdomen, the pressure caused his internal organs to burst through his chest and clavicle area. They said the man remained conscious and felt everything up to a certain point because the roller moved so slowly. The bomb squad guy told it like it was just another Tuesday. I still wish he hadn't shown me those pictures. Later in the season, we heard that the man had been an informant and someone had discovered it. Story 22. I know I'm super late to this, but my parents have an incredible story from their wedding night. My dad's cousin was high up in the state police and doing undercover work at the time, trying to bust a drug ring. He was invited to the wedding and, under special circumstances, was allowed to break cover for the event. Now, my mom's side of the family was a bit more rough around the edges. Her father, my grandfather, brought a few of his old hunting buddies along. My parents had never met them before, but it was the bride's father, so he got to invite whoever he wanted. At the wedding ceremony, my dad's cousin looked uncomfortable the entire time. When they got to the reception, he gave my dad a quick congratulations, handed over a gift, and left shortly after. Then my grandpa and his hunting buddies approached. One of them handed my dad $1,000 in cash and said, "Hey, I don't know you, but sorry I'm an asshole," and left. My parents didn't think much of it. Until the following week, as they were preparing to leave for their honeymoon, the state police came knocking at the door. Turns out that hunting buddy was the top suspect in the very case my dad's cousin was investigating. The police were there to secure the wedding photos and guest list, fearing retaliation. They believed the drug ring might go after anyone who had seen or photographed the undercover officer. The wedding had compromised my dad's cousin's cover, and he was forced to move in on the ring earlier than planned, all because of my parents' wedding. Story 23. Probably going to get buried here, but my criminal investigations professor in sophomore year told us some wild stories from back in the 1980s when he worked undercover in West Germany. He had been embedded for about 5 years. One story he shared involved a case that had gone on for about 6 months, involving drugs and weapons. Nothing too outrageous at first. He was about to purchase a kilo of coca from a contact when one of the other men in the house, who had apparently been suspicious of him for weeks, decided he was going to take action. That guy, who outranked the one selling the drugs, informed the others that he believed my professor was a UC and that he planned to take care of it after the deal. They spoke in German, thinking my professor didn't understand a word, but he was fluent. He had just been pretending not to be. He overheard the entire conversation. I don't know exactly how his backup was arranged, but he managed to give a signal to someone outside. A shot came through the window moments later. Instead of just tackling the man with the gun, my professor did something wild. He grabbed the coffee table in the middle of the room and threw it at the guy. He literally picked up a full-size table and hurled it like something out of an action movie. Knocked the guy out cold. He caught some flack for it in the weeks that followed, as it was considered excessive force. But let's be real. If you're thousands of miles from home, surrounded by armed dealers, and you hear someone say they're going to take you outside and end you, your instinct is probably going to be, grab the nearest object and launch it. Story 24. I know a guy who used to work undercover for the DEA in Mexico. He infiltrated multiple gangs and cartels and was responsible for getting a lot of high-level figures arrested. He once told me about an incident where some cartel leaders pulled him into a shed. Inside, a man was tied up, kneeling in the middle of the floor. They handed my friend a revolver and told him that the man was a mole, someone who had leaked information to the authorities. They said he needed to prove his loyalty by shooting the man in the head. He was freaking out because, up until that point, he hadn't had to do anything that violent. But he knew he couldn't blow his cover. So without hesitation, he walked up, aimed, and pulled the trigger. The gun was loaded with blanks. It was a test. They suspected he might be a cop. Not long after, he managed to get everyone involved arrested. This guy was missing a couple of fingers, which he always claimed was due to a horse riding accident. But after hearing more about his time in the DEA, I wouldn't be surprised if the truth was far more gruesome. Eventually, he had to be pulled out of Mexico and placed into hiding. His cover had been blown, and the cartel started targeting his family. Story 25. Not undercover myself, but I was hired by a gay police officer to help give the appearance that he was straight, just for protection. I'd attend events and be photographed with him. In his department, if they found out you were gay, they'd assign you to a very dangerous part of the city alone at night. He had already been shot once under those circumstances. He was young and good-looking, so they'd send him on prostitution stings, both in upscale hotels and on the streets. They'd give him $300, a Rolex from evidence, a wedding ring, and a suit. He'd sit in the lobby of a luxury hotel drinking soda, waiting for women to approach. He could buy them drinks and make conversation, but the moment one said she'd do something for money, he'd lightly place his hand on her lower back and whisper that it was time to go. Once outside, she'd be arrested. I enjoy dining at fine hotels, but I eat very slowly. To avoid making friends wait, I often go alone. On 3 different occasions, undercover officers mistook me for a worker. After they bought me drinks, I would gently place my hand on their back, look them in the eye and say, "Thanks for the drinks, officer. Can I enjoy my meal in peace now?" He once said that, during street stings, some women move fast. Like one had him exposed before he could even turn on his lights. He even caught syphilis once from a woman working Calle Ocho who went straight to business within seconds of meeting. Before anyone says, "They're not hurting anyone," let me explain a common scam. Some of the women would see the wedding ring, slip a pill into your drink, and rob you blind. They'd take cash, watches, but leave behind your IDs, credit cards, and passport. Anything that would require a report. Because filing a police report after being robbed by a worker could lead to divorce and public embarrassment, most victims wouldn't say a word. Sometimes they'd even plant a condom on the floor and take photos for blackmail. Story 26. Finally, a story I can share. Not mine, but a friend's father had a wild experience. He was a trained negotiator with a psychology degree and was placed in a prison for one day as part of a covert operation to test the facility's security. Only the prison director knew he wasn't a real inmate. Here's what happened. While posing as an inmate, he managed to acquire a knife in the kitchen and took 2 hostages. He said he took 2 because the first one collapsed almost immediately from the stress, and he actually felt bad for the guy, so he let him go. The second hostage lasted a few more hours. The most surprising part? He actually managed to leave the prison undetected. It wasn't until he walked a few meters beyond the gate that he spotted a SWAT team with snipers locked on him. That's when he finally panicked and surrendered. It was all part of a test, but the fact that he nearly made it out says a lot about how flawed the system was. Story 27. My father-in-law did undercover work in the South during the early 1980s. There had been a brutal robbery and murder of an elderly woman, and the police were certain her son was responsible, but they couldn't pin it on him for one reason or another. So, while he was still walking free, they came up with a plan to get him to confess. My father-in-law went undercover and started hanging around the guy. He told him he was looking to hire a hitman for an easy job that paid well and said he needed someone with experience, hoping the guy would admit to having killed before. But instead, the guy said, "Oh, I know just the person. He just got back into town." It's important to note that the man he referred to was black. Not wanting to blow his cover, my father-in-law went along with it and asked to meet him. The original suspect gave him the guy's street name. When my father-in-law looked him up in the prison system, it turned out he was a known killer who had just been released from one of the roughest prisons in the U.S. Now they had a new problem, someone far more dangerous than the man they were actually targeting. They didn't want to break cover but needed a way to scare him off. So they set up a meeting at a bar, planted undercover officers inside wearing printed white supremacy and KKK shirts, and brought my Fael in to sit at a table with his gun drawn and hidden under it, just in case. He told the guy the job he was hiring for would be on behalf of one of the men wearing the shirts. Without saying a word, the man turned and walked out. They eventually got the original suspect on another murder he committed later. Story 28. My dad's longtime friend is a retired detective who used to do undercover work. We used to celebrate the 4th of July with him, and he'd tell the kids fun police stories. But when I got older and started thinking about going into law enforcement, he began sharing the darker side of the job. A few years ago, he told me about a time he had to commit a drive-by shooting and a home invasion to maintain his cover with a gang. He said that when they were near the target's house, the gang leader handed him a handgun and told him to shoot. Normally, he carried 2 guns while undercover, one with real bullets in case he was exposed, and one with blanks for fake scenarios like firing at police for show. But this time, he had no control. He was given a loaded gun and had to use it. He was in the back seat on the passenger side and angled his shots to avoid hitting the house, while the rest of the gang opened fire. That same night, they committed a home invasion. No one was killed, but several people were injured. He didn't hurt anyone himself. He held the man of the house at gunpoint while the woman was tied up. Once they were both restrained, he helped ransack the place. Ballistics later confirmed none of the rounds matched the gun he was given. Still, 4 people were injured in the shooting. It's a story that always stuck with me. Story 29. Back in the early 2000s, our neighbor's house was owned by a law enforcement family. The father was retired law enforcement. One son was in Undercover DARS SWAT, and the other was a deputy. They were all based in Detroit, but used the rural house for hunting trips. John, the Undercover/SWAT guy, was down more often than the others. I used to mow their lawn every week. One day while mowing, a guy in a dirty newer truck pulled up and asked if I was alone. I was, but I told him my dad was inside cleaning his guns. He laughed and started walking toward me saying, "I think you're alone." I panicked, grabbed my belt knife, and told him to get off the property or I'd call the police. He laughed again and said, "Don't worry, short of 07. It's me, John." I started laughing nervously. He looked totally different, skinnier, less muscular, with long, dirty hair and a beard. He told me he'd just finished a major bust and had to leave town fast. He had stopped by a SWAT safe house, grabbed his pre-packed bag and left. He told me stories of living in drug houses so contaminated you could get high just by sitting on the couch. He said there were only a few times his cover was close to being blown, and they had to extract early. One time while searching for a suspect in a house, they were walking up a narrow stairway when someone started shooting through the wall with an AK-47. Another time, after a meth lab explosion, he and a rookie were preparing to bag a body. He asked the rookie if he wanted arms or legs. The rookie chose legs. John told me, "Never choose legs." When the rookie pulled on them, the skin came right off. He might have been exaggerating, but his stories were unforgettable every time he came down. Story 30. Not me, but a family friend of mine worked over 10 years as an undercover cop in New York City. He's seen a lot of dark and intense things, but this is one of the funnier stories he's told me. As an undercover officer, he often wore elaborate costumes and disguises. One time he went undercover dressed as a Hasidic Jew. Apparently there was significant drug activity and other crimes happening within that community, and they were trying to crack down. His task was to enter an illegally operated brothel, confirm the setup, and then signal a SWAT team to move in. He and his partner, both dressed in full Hasidic attire, walked into the brothel, which he said was a run-down, filthy apartment. Trying not to blow his cover, he played the role of a customer. One of the women led him into a room, thinking things were about to happen. His job at that point was to text the SWAT team and give the signal. But there was a problem. He had no cell service. He had to stall for as long as he could, hoping either the team would pick up on the delay or that his signal would return. He started arguing with the woman about the agreed price, then began listing outrageous and specific things he wanted her to do, while never actually engaging in anything sual. He claimed he was too nervous, all while just rambling and delaying, hoping for a miracle. Eventually, the SWAT team finally burst in, making the arrest. Mission accomplished, though not quite how it was supposed to go. Story 31. Might be late to the party, but I've got a story worth sharing. A very close friend of mine still works undercover in a high-crime area. Can't say where, and he swore me to keep quiet outside of a small circle. He's told me plenty of intense stories, but one still stands out. After successfully making a drug bust, testifying in court, and helping convict the suspect, he thought it was behind him. But less than 2 years later, that same guy was back on the streets. My friend was out with his wife and 5-year-old child, far from where he worked. While putting his kid into the car, he looked up and saw the same dealer, this time with 2 other guys. They stared at each other for a few seconds before the other men ran to their car. My friend quickly got his family into his vehicle and took off. He was soon being chased, aggressively, by the men in the other car, who began waving a gun at him and trying to swerve him off the road. After what felt like an eternity, flashing lights appeared behind them. My friend pulled over, thinking help had finally arrived. But instead, he was pulled from his car at gunpoint and thrown to the ground. The officers didn't realize he was law enforcement. Meanwhile, the suspects were trying to escape. I don't remember exactly how they were stopped, but they were eventually caught. With guns drawn, chaos everywhere, and confusion all around, the officers were simply trying to sort out what they thought was a case of dangerous street racing. Once things calmed down, my friend managed to identify himself and show his badge. He had a black eye and was roughed up a bit. The suspects were arrested, again, and went back to court. Thankfully, his family wasn't harmed, but they had to move again. That night changed everything for him. He said he now fully understands the anxiety people feel when a police car is behind them, whether you're innocent, licensed, or insured. He told me, after that night, I get it. Story 32. Not a cop, but a civilian. When I was 18, I went on a school-sponsored ski trip with my senior class and a few parents. One of the parents on the trip happened to be an undercover cop. At one of our train stops, a guy approached me and asked if I wanted to buy weed or pills. I told him no thanks, that none of us were into that kind of thing, and he walked away. I casually mentioned it to the parents later, not thinking anything would come of it. After we got back on the train, some friends and I headed to the entertainment car to hang out, grab snacks and play cards. A few of us were sitting and playing when the same guy who had offered me drugs earlier showed up and sat down with us. He started talking, casually sharing his life story, where he was from, what he was doing, even his full name. Word got back to the undercover cop, who then approached me and asked for a favor. He wanted me to find the guy and bring him to the car where the parents were, under the pretense that my dad wanted to buy drugs. So I went searching through the train cars and found the guy asleep. I woke him up and said, "Hey, I'm not interested in buying anything, but my dad is." The guy said okay and followed me. I brought him to the car where the undercover cop, posing as my dad, and a few other parents were sitting. The cop made a small purchase of pills while we all watched it unfold. The guy then left and went back to sleep. The cop told me they were going to wait until we crossed into Nebraska, where he had jurisdiction, to make the arrest. When we got to McCook, Nebraska, police officers were waiting. They boarded the train and arrested the dealer. In order to exit the train, he had to walk right past our entire class, including me. He stared at me the entire time. My heart was racing, and I was genuinely scared. Fortunately, my classmates could see how nervous I was and surrounded me for support. Turns out the guy had a warrant in Boulder and was headed to Florida with his girlfriend to buy a trailer. A few news outlets picked up the story, though my name was never mentioned. Several parents wrote me letters afterward, thanking me for helping. I felt a bit guilty at the time for turning him in, but ultimately, I figured if you're trying to sell drugs to kids, you kind of get what's coming. Story 33. I'm not a cop, but I once had an experience with one at a water park rave. I was 21, riding a high of liquid confidence and going around asking random people for Molly. Eventually, I asked a woman who looked to be about 30. She said she wanted to join me in the search, and I thought, all right, cool. New mom wants in on the fun. We wandered around together while I kept asking people for Molly, and she just hung out. Along the way, we started talking and actually got to know each other a little. After a while, she turned to me and said, "I'm an undercover cop," followed by, "You're adorable, but wow, you're an idiot." To her credit, she stuck around. And honestly, they should have hired me, because I ended up scoring free Molly about 20 minutes later. So this poor undercover cop had to spend about an hour with me, a 21-year-old completely intoxicated version of myself. That hour included me lightly puking, fighting with my boyfriend, having an emotional breakdown because I couldn't pee in the pool with people around, collecting and chain smoking like 20 cigarettes for no reason, trying to set her up with random guys and mooning people repeatedly while laughing and high-fiving myself. She was a champ for sticking around. Story 34. A long time ago, I was working in a remote region outside of the US. The place we were staying was run by a former American who had clearly lived a wild life. Over time, he shared a few stories from his days undercover. Looking back, I think he might have been in witness protection, though I can't say for sure. He told us he had been a cop in the 1970s, working undercover in a biker gang that ran a large drug operation. From the sound of it, he was deep undercover for a couple of years. He got close with the gang's main dealer, and they'd cruise around the city in a sweet Mustang. One day, while driving behind a school bus, some girls in the back row started flirting with them. When the bus stopped, the girls got off, jumped into the Mustang, and ended up back at the dealer's place. He said they gave them coke and slept with them. He didn't say how old the girls were, but I got the impression they were probably around 17 or 18. Being naive at the time, I asked him whether he had to take the drugs to maintain his cover. He told me his personal rule was no needles, but everything else, he did whatever the other guys were doing. Story 35. Both of my parents are retired FBI agents and played significant roles in the Manuel Noriega case. During that time, my father worked undercover with Enrique Pretelt, assisting in the smuggling of a 400,000-pound shipment of marijuana from Panama. That operation eventually led to Pretelt's arrest and conviction. My father was also a close friend of Joe Pistone, better known as Donnie Brasco. While the film Donnie Brasco contains fictional elements, my father has said many of Pistone's challenges depicted in the movie were very much grounded in reality. It's a fantastic film, especially if you're interested in the life of undercover agents. Earlier in his career, my dad spent a lot of time working undercover with the mafia in New York. I'm not sure if he was involved in anything particularly wild, but I do know he formed lasting friendships that extended well beyond his FBI days. I remember, even years later, he would occasionally receive Christmas cards from members of those families. Undercover officers often carry a rough reputation in criminal circles, and much of it is deserved. But that's not always the case. My dad has told me on more than one occasion that some individuals he arrested later thanked him, saying he saved their lives by getting them out of dangerous situations. Many of them weren't hardened criminals, just people pulled into that lifestyle due to family connections or poor choices. It's complicated, but human. Story 36. At one point in my career, I was working to uncover an international trafficking ring, and I went deep undercover posing as a male escort. The goal was to gather intel from within, blending in and casually asking questions to learn who was running what and how things worked. One night, I joined a group of women at a bachelor party. At some point, a few of us went to the bathroom to freshen up, and one of them pulled out coca. Not wanting to blow my cover, I played along and did a few lines. I had never touched the stuff before, but I was committed to the role. The night continued with drinking, dancing, and plenty of wild moments, too many to count. As the party wound down, most of the women left, but I stayed behind with a few of the guests. Let's just say I was very well received. It was intense, awkward, and oddly affirming. The next day around noon, I got a call from my boss. I was taken off the case for what they labeled reckless behavior. Turns out I hadn't infiltrated anything criminal. It was just a regular bachelor party, and I'd completely misjudged the situation. Despite the embarrassment, I don't really regret any of it. I retired a year later, and oddly enough, one of the guys from that party is now my spouse. We're married and raising 3 adopted kids together. Life is unpredictable. Story 37. I'm not a cop, but I worked as a probation officer. In the smaller county where I worked, we had to do one late-night visit each month, checking in on probationers at home. One of our managers was married to an undercover cop. One night, my partner and I were assigned to visit a client in a pretty rough part of town. Things were already going sideways with the client. We decided not to go to her house after seeing some concerning behavior. We were in a marked vehicle too, which didn't help. The next morning, I went into the office and got pulled aside by my manager. Apparently, we had unintentionally ruined an undercover drug operation her husband was involved in. When we drove by in our clearly marked car, we spooked the target of the sting. The suspect panicked, and the undercover officer, my manager's husband, had to act along with it. The deal fell through. We had no idea at the time, but I guess that's how thin the line can be when multiple departments work the same neighborhoods. Story 38. This story might fit the bill. I once considered buying and renovating a home with beautiful architecture in a neighborhood that had once been vibrant but had slowly deteriorated into an area known for drugs and crime. Still, there was a lot of talk about revitalization. Buy low and reap the rewards. After walking through the wreckage, scorched walls from squatters' fires and layers of decay, I realized I wasn't up to the task and passed on it. Sometime later, the realtor told me that a police officer had bought the house. Apparently, he wasn't intimidated by the neighborhood. A year or two later, the area had improved enough that they were organizing a home tour and asking for volunteers. I signed up, and to my surprise, the home I had once considered was one of my assignments. Excited, I walked through it and was amazed by the transformation. It was stunning. In the kitchen, I ran into the owner, I told him I had seen the house in its worst state and congratulated him on the incredible work. As we made small talk, I mentioned that being a police officer probably helped him feel safer living in the still rough neighborhood. He quickly, almost too quickly, corrected me and said he was a firefighter at a nearby station. I was puzzled by both my mistake and his reaction, so I apologized and moved on. Later, as I was walking through another part of the house, he pulled me into the laundry room and explained quietly that he was, in fact, a police officer working undercover in the area, and that he didn't want his neighbors to know. Story 39. This one's from my dad from about 2 years ago. He worked in Special Investigative Services in Los Angeles, which handles cases where there isn't quite enough evidence to convict someone, but law enforcement is certain something illegal is happening. He had one of his guys, let's call him Joe, go undercover as a hitman after a tip that a CEO wanted to have his business partner eliminated to take control of the company. The goal was to get the man on tape explicitly ordering the hit. They arranged to meet in a hotel parking lot. While they waited, the surveillance team passed the time by photoshopping Joe's face onto famous movie hitmen, Agent 47, John Wick, that kind of thing, and sending the images to each other. Eventually, the target arrived and handed Joe a duffel bag full of cash. The whole time, the guy was saying vague things like, "Take care of my partner," but they needed a specific phrase for the charge to stick. Joe kept asking things like, "How do you want me to do it?" After some hesitation, the guy finally said, "I don't care how you do it, just kill him." At that exact moment, police vans pulled up and a helicopter lifted off from behind the hotel. They arrested the man on the spot. He was charged with conspiracy to commit murder and other crimes. I saw the footage myself. It looked like a scene straight out of CSI. Wild to think things like this still happen in real life. Story 40. A family friend of ours was a police officer who went fully undercover. He even had what they called a real fake driver's license, one that would scan with a different address and full alias. I'm pretty sure they also set him up with an apartment he lived in and operated out of. He could only share limited details, but there were moments where he'd casually check his phone and say something like, "Gotta go buy some coke, be right back." He'd leave, do the buy to gather evidence, and that would be it. Sometimes there'd be an arrest right after, and other times they'd hold off to build a bigger case. When my mom ran into him at the gym, she was always hesitant to say anything, never sure if he was in character or off duty. His wife told me that when they were out grocery shopping or grabbing food, if he spotted someone connected to his cases, he would quietly walk away. Sometimes he'd even leave the store entirely. At first, she was confused and upset by it, but over time, she came to understand that it was just part of the job. Story 41. This is kind of a funny or infuriating story, depending on how you look at it. One time, one of our undercover crime suppression unit officers was working his very first prostitution sting. The operation used a random house in a rough neighborhood, and his sergeant decided it would be funny to play a prank on him. The plan was simple. Once the undercover officer made the deal with the target and offered her a drink, the backup team would move in and make the arrest. Everything was going according to plan. The deal was made and the officer offered her a glass of water. But nothing happened. Confused, the officer got up and slowly walked toward the kitchen to get the water. The only problem? He had no idea where anything was in the house. He fumbled through cabinets, trying to find a glass. The woman quickly grew suspicious. She asked why he didn't know where the glasses were in his own house. Her suspicion escalated, and she suddenly grabbed her phone, yelling into it for someone to come pick her up. The officer, now panicking, began urgently speaking into his mic for the team to enter. They finally did, but not before the woman pulled a knife on him and her armed pimp appeared from around the corner. Both the woman and the pimp were safely detained without further incident. As for the sergeant who orchestrated the prank, he was fired after a brief internal investigation.